Charleston, South Carolina. March 17, 1860. The hour just before dawn. A young man stands at his bedroom window on the third floor of the Whitmore estate, watching the horizon turn from black to deep purple. His name is Thomas Whitmore III, 24 years old, heir to one of the wealthiest plantation fortunes in the American South. In 6 hours, his father will discover the letters. In 12 hours, the entire social fabric of Charleston's elite will begin to tear apart. In 3 days, someone will be dead. But right now, at this moment, Thomas doesn't know any of that yet. He's simply watching the day break over a city that's about to devour him whole. This is not a story about the Civil War, though the war is coming. Everyone can feel it in the air like static before a lightning strike. This is not a story about slavery, though slavery permeates every single moment of what you're about to hear. This is a story about a choice. One choice. The kind of choice that seems small when you make it, a glance held too long, a hand touched in passing, a conversation that goes deeper than it should. The kind of choice that compounds, day after day, until suddenly you're standing on the other side of an invisible line you never meant to cross. The letters that will be found this morning are written in 2 different hands. One elegant, educated, flowing across expensive paper with the confidence of someone trained in penmanship from childhood. The other hand is rougher, less practiced, formed by someone who learned to write in secret, by candlelight, after the day's labor was done. Thomas Whitmore didn't plan to fall in love. Nobody ever does. And he certainly didn't plan to fall in love with someone whose very existence in his world was defined by ownership, by law, by chains both literal and invisible. What happened next would become whispered about in Charleston drawing rooms for decades. The official records would be altered. Family Bibles would be rewritten. Gravestones would tell lies. But the truth, the real truth, has a way of surviving in the margins, in the spaces between what people say and what they refuse to say. This is that truth. Before we continue with this story, if you're finding this fascinating and want to hear more dark history like this, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Now, let's continue. To understand what Thomas Whitmore was about to lose, you have to understand what Charleston was in 1860. Picture a city drunk on its own wealth and beauty. Mansions with Greek columns line streets shaded by live oaks draped in Spanish moss. The air smells like salt marsh, jasmine, and the sweet rot of money, money made from cotton, rice, and indigo. Money made from human bondage. Charleston wasn't just wealthy, it was old wealth, generations deep. The kind of wealth that builds opera houses and thinks nothing of it. The kind of wealth that sends sons to Harvard and daughters to finishing schools in Boston. The kind of wealth that requires an entire system of human suffering to maintain itself, and has convinced itself this is not only acceptable but divinely ordained. The social hierarchy here is rigid as iron. At the top sit families like the Whitmores, plantation owners whose fathers and grandfathers built fortunes that stretch back to the 1600s. Below them, a smaller class of merchants, lawyers, and doctors who serve the plantation elite. Below them, poor whites who own no enslaved people but cling desperately to their racial status as the only thing separating them from the bottom. And at the bottom, making all of it possible, over 400,000 enslaved black people across South Carolina, human beings treated as property, as commodities, as something less than human. The Whitmore Plantation, Ashwood Hall, sits 12 miles outside Charleston proper. 3,000 acres. 247 enslaved people. Cotton fields that stretch to the horizon. A main house with 22 rooms, built in 1789 by Thomas's great-grandfather, who fought in the Revolutionary War and apparently saw no contradiction between fighting for liberty while owning other human beings. Thomas Whitmore III was born into this world on a humid July night in 1836. The third Thomas Whitmore, the second son. His older brother, William, was groomed to take over Ashwood Hall. Thomas was the spare. Still important, still wealthy beyond measure, but with slightly more freedom to choose his own path. He studied literature at the College of Charleston. He read philosophy. He spent long afternoons in his father's library, consuming books that asked uncomfortable questions about justice, morality, and natural rights. His father, Thomas Whitmore II, 58 years old in 1860, was everything Charleston society expected a plantation patriarch to be. Dignified. Stern. Convinced that the social order was not just practical but righteous. He attended St. Michael's Episcopal Church every Sunday, sat on the vestry board, and never once questioned whether it was moral to own human beings while singing hymns about God's love for all people. His mother, Catherine Ashworth Whitmore, came from an equally prominent Charleston family. She ran the household with precision, managed social obligations with grace, and taught her children that their position in society was both a privilege and a responsibility. She believed deeply in charity, for the deserving poor, of course. She believed in kindness, as long as it didn't threaten the established order. Thomas grew up surrounded by enslaved people who served his family's every need. He was dressed by enslaved hands as a child. His food was prepared by enslaved cooks. His horse was groomed by enslaved stable workers. The gardens he walked through were maintained by enslaved gardeners. This was so normal, so completely woven into the fabric of daily life, that questioning it would have been like questioning gravity. Except Thomas did question it. Not at first, not as a child. But slowly, as he got older, as he read more, as he actually looked at the people around him instead of through them. He began to notice things. The way his father's overseer spoke to the field workers. The scars on people's backs. The way mothers held their children a little tighter when white men approached. The fear that lived in people's eyes even when they were smiling. By 1859, when Thomas was 23, he had become what Charleston society called difficult. He asked uncomfortable questions at dinner parties. He suggested that perhaps the system of slavery might not be morally defensible. He read abolitionist literature in secret. His father worried that Northern schooling had poisoned his mind with dangerous ideas. But Thomas was still his father's son. He still lived at Ashwood Hall. He still benefited from every privilege his family's wealth provided. He still attended society balls and charmed young women whose fathers owned plantations just like his own. He was troubled by the system, yes, but he hadn't truly confronted it. Not until her. Her name was Sarah. 22 years old. Born on the Whitmore plantation to a mother who worked in the main house and a father whose name nobody recorded because enslaved marriages weren't recognized by law. Sarah was what they called a house servant. She worked inside the main house, not in the fields. She could read, which was technically illegal in South Carolina but happened anyway in wealthy households where enslaved people were sometimes taught so they could read recipes or take messages. She was smart. She was careful. She knew exactly how dangerous the world was for someone like her. She knew the rules and she followed them, kept her eyes down, spoke when spoken to, made herself as invisible as possible. Until the moment she couldn't anymore. Because Thomas Whitmore saw her. Really saw her. Not as a servant. Not as property. But as a person. As someone with thoughts and dreams and a mind that was every bit as complex as his own. And that moment of recognition. That simple act of seeing someone fully, was about to set off a chain of events that would destroy everything they both knew. The first real conversation happened in September of 1859, in the library at Ashwood Hall. Thomas had come in looking for a specific book, a volume of Emerson's essays that he'd been meaning to reread. He found Sarah there, dusting the shelves, and she was holding the same book. She'd been reading it. Standing there in the afternoon light, completely absorbed, unaware he'd entered the room. When she finally noticed him, the fear that crossed her face was immediate and absolute. She'd been caught doing something forbidden. Reading when she should have been working. Touching books that belonged to the master's family. The punishment for such things could be severe. But Thomas didn't call for his father. He didn't reprimand her. Instead, he asked her what she thought of it. Of Emerson. Of the essay on self-reliance. And for a moment, Sarah stood there frozen, trying to calculate whether this was a trap. Whether answering honestly would make things worse. But something in Thomas's expression told her he genuinely wanted to know. So she told him. She said she thought Emerson was idealistic. That self-reliance was a luxury afforded only to those who already had power. That it was easy to talk about individualism and freedom when you weren't someone's property. Thomas stood there, stunned. Not because she'd challenged him, though that was part of it, but because her analysis was sharper, more incisive than anything he'd heard from his college professors. They talked for 20 minutes. Then 30. Then an hour. About books. About philosophy. About the fundamental contradictions of American ideals. When Thomas finally left the library, something had shifted in him. He'd had conversations with enslaved people before, of course. Surface conversations, the kind where power dynamics made genuine exchange impossible. But this was different. This was two minds meeting as equals, even though the world around them insisted they could never be equal. He started finding reasons to be in the library when Sarah was there. At first, he told himself it was intellectual curiosity. She was intelligent and well-read despite having been given almost no formal education. He wanted to know what she thought about things. But intellectual curiosity doesn't explain why his heart started beating faster when he heard her footsteps in the hallway. It doesn't explain why he started thinking about her at night, replaying their conversations, imagining what she might say about this book or that idea. It doesn't explain why, when she smiled, which was rare, and always quickly hidden, he felt something in his chest tighten and release at the same time. Sarah knew what was happening before Thomas did. She'd seen it before. White men becoming interested in enslaved women. But usually that interest was predatory, violent, an exercise of power that ended in trauma and unwanted children. This felt different, and that made it more dangerous, not less. Because if Thomas was developing genuine feelings for her, if this wasn't just physical desire but something deeper, then they were both walking toward a cliff edge with no guardrails. The rules were clear. A white man could rape an enslaved woman with impunity. That happened every day across the South, and society looked the other way. But a white man genuinely loving an enslaved woman? That threatened the entire social order. That suggested enslaved people were fully human, capable of inspiring the same depths of feeling as white women. That was unthinkable. That was revolutionary. That could get them both killed. By November, they were meeting deliberately. After dark, in the old carriage house that nobody used anymore. Thomas would bring books and candles. Sarah would bring her thoughts, her questions, her careful observations about the world around them. They talked about everything. About freedom and what it meant. About justice and whether it was possible in a world built on such profound injustice. About God and whether any deity worth worshipping would sanction the enslavement of human beings. These conversations were dangerous in themselves. If anyone discovered them, even without any romantic element, Thomas would be considered dangerously radical and Sarah would be considered dangerously educated. The punishment would be severe. But the conversations weren't the most dangerous part. The most dangerous part was the way Thomas started looking at Sarah. The way his hand would brush hers when he handed her a book. The way they'd fall silent sometimes, just looking at each other, the air between them charged with everything they couldn't say. The way Sarah's guard would drop, just for a moment, and Thomas would see not the careful mask she showed the world but the real person underneath, funny, sharp, angry at the injustice of her existence, terrified of hoping for anything better. The first time Thomas told her he loved her, it was December. A cold night for Charleston, frost on the ground. They were in the carriage house, and Sarah had just finished reading a passage from Frederick Douglass's autobiography, another forbidden book Thomas had smuggled onto the plantation. She was crying, which he'd never seen before. She said she didn't know whether reading made things better or worse. Whether it was a gift or a curse to know that other people lived free while she never would. Thomas reached for her hand without thinking, and suddenly they were closer than they'd ever been. He said it without planning to. "I love you." 3 words that changed everything. Sarah pulled away like she'd been burned. She said he didn't understand what he was saying. That this wasn't love, it couldn't be love, because love required a future and they had no future. That he was playing with her life, with her survival, with her mother's survival, with everyone she knew. That if anyone discovered his feelings, she'd be sold away at best, killed at worst. That his love, if that's what it was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to her. Thomas tried to argue. He said they could find a way. They could run north, to a free state. He had money, connections. They could build a life together somewhere nobody knew them. Sarah laughed, and it was the saddest sound Thomas had ever heard. She said he still didn't understand. That running north meant abandoning her mother, her friends, everyone she'd ever known. That even if they made it, which was unlikely, given how many enslaved people were captured and returned, even if they made it north, she'd still be a fugitive. Still legally his father's property. Still subject to the Fugitive Slave Act that required northern states to return escaped enslaved people to their owners. That his privilege had made him naive about how the world actually worked for people like her. But despite all her arguments, despite her fear, despite her anger at him for putting her in this impossible position, she loved him too. She'd tried not to. She'd tried to keep their interactions purely intellectual, to maintain distance, to remember every moment that he was the master's son and she was property. But the heart doesn't follow commands. The heart does what it wants, even when what it wants will destroy you. So they're in the carriage house, with frost on the ground outside and danger pressing in from all sides. Sarah admitted the truth. She loved him. God help her, she loved him. And that admission was both the most honest thing she'd ever said and the most dangerous. They started making plans. Desperate, probably doomed plans, but plans nonetheless. Thomas would convert some of his wealth into gold and currency that couldn't be easily traced. He'd make contact with Underground Railroad operatives in Charleston. There were free black people and some sympathetic whites who helped enslaved people escape north. They'd wait until spring, when travel would be easier. They'd head for Pennsylvania, where they had some chance of building a new life. Thomas even talked about going further, to Canada, where Sarah would be truly free from American law. It was risky. It was probably insane. But what was the alternative? Living the rest of their lives sneaking moments in the carriage house, always afraid, always hiding, knowing that discovery was inevitable and punishment would be brutal? But making plans and executing plans are 2 different things. And in Charleston in 1860, there were eyes everywhere. Enslaved people watched other enslaved people, sometimes because they'd been coerced to inform, sometimes out of jealousy or spite. White people watched enslaved people constantly, looking for any sign of insubordination or resistance. Thomas's changed behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. His father remarked that he seemed distracted, secretive. His mother mentioned that he'd been spending a lot of time alone, disappearing at odd hours. His older brother William joked that Thomas must have a sweetheart somewhere, and Thomas's panicked expression before he managed to compose himself was noted. And Sarah's behavior had changed too. She was quieter, more withdrawn. The other enslaved people in the main house noticed she'd been sneaking off at night. Her mother, Margaret, who worked as the head cook, was terrified. She knew her daughter. She knew Sarah was too smart, too careful to take unnecessary risks. Which meant whatever she was doing, she thought it was necessary. Margaret confronted Sarah in late December, after Christmas. She begged her daughter to tell her what was happening. Sarah couldn't lie to her mother, so she told a partial truth. She said she'd been teaching herself more reading in secret, studying books from the library. Margaret didn't believe her, but she also knew better than to push. She just said whatever Sarah was doing, she needed to stop. That no book, no knowledge, no secret plan was worth the risk. That Margaret couldn't survive losing her daughter. That she needed to be smart and patient, and maybe someday things would be different. But things weren't going to be different. Not in South Carolina in 1860. In fact, things were getting worse. The political situation was deteriorating rapidly. Abraham Lincoln was likely to be elected president in the fall, and the Southern states were openly talking about secession. The atmosphere was tense, paranoid. White Southerners were convinced that Northern abolitionists were plotting slave rebellions. There were rumors of insurrection, whispers of violence. Punishments were getting harsher. The patrol system, white men who rode around at night looking for enslaved people who were out without passes, was more aggressive than ever. This was the worst possible time for Thomas and Sarah to be planning an escape. But it was also, paradoxically, the best time. Because in the chaos of political upheaval and potential war, two people might slip through the cracks unnoticed. Thomas started writing letters to contacts in the North. Carefully worded letters that didn't say anything explicit but hinted at his intentions. He reached out to a Quaker family in Philadelphia that his mother knew. They'd been kind to him during a visit years ago, and he'd heard rumors they were sympathetic to abolition. He wrote to a former college friend who'd moved to Boston and expressed anti-slavery views. He was building a network, creating the possibility of help when they arrived in the North. But letters could be intercepted. Letters could be read by the wrong people. And Thomas was young, in love, and not nearly as careful as he needed to be. Sarah, meanwhile, was gathering information from the other enslaved people. Who on the plantation could be trusted? Who had connections to the Underground Railroad? What were the best routes north? How did people avoid the patrols? She learned that there was a free black minister in Charleston who sometimes helped with escapes. She learned about safe houses, places where fugitives could hide during the day before traveling at night. She learned about the codes and signals the Underground Railroad used. A quilt with a certain pattern hung on a fence meant it was safe to approach. A lantern in a specific window meant help was available. She was methodical, careful, asking questions without revealing why she was asking. But I wasn't careful enough. Because someone noticed. Several someones, actually. The other enslaved women in the main house noticed Sarah's odd questions. They noticed her disappearances at night. They noticed the way she sometimes seemed distracted, her mind somewhere else. Most of them said nothing. There was an unspoken code among enslaved people that you didn't betray each other to the masters if you could help it. But there was one woman, Lucinda, who had reasons to resent Sarah. Lucinda's son had been sold off the plantation 2 years earlier to pay Thomas's father's gambling debts. Her grief had curdled into anger, and that anger needed a target. Sarah, with her literacy and her special treatment as a house servant, made an easy target. So Lucinda started watching Sarah more carefully. And what she saw made her suspicious. Sarah sneaking out after dark. Sarah asking questions about routes north. Sarah with books hidden under her apron. Lucinda went to the overseer, a man named Silas Crenshaw. Crenshaw was 45, cruel, and utterly loyal to Thomas's father. He'd worked at Ashwood Hall for 15 years, and he'd built his reputation on maintaining absolute control through fear and violence. Lucinda told Crenshaw she thought Sarah might be planning to run away. She didn't mention Thomas, she didn't know about Thomas, but she gave Crenshaw enough information to make him pay attention. Crenshaw told Thomas's father. And Thomas Whitmore too decided to investigate. This is where the story accelerates toward catastrophe. This is where all the careful plans and secret meetings and whispered promises start to unravel. Because Thomas's father wasn't a stupid man. He'd built and maintained a massive plantation fortune by being observant and ruthless. He started watching Sarah. He started watching his son. And he began to suspect there was a connection between his son's strange behavior and Sarah's suspicious activities. He didn't want to believe it. The idea that his son might have romantic feelings for an enslaved woman was repulsive to him, not because of Sarah specifically, but because of what it represented. A rejection of everything their family stood for. A betrayal of their social position. A kind of treason against his own race. On March 15, 1860, Thomas's father confronted him. Not about Sarah, not directly. He asked Thomas about his plans for the future. Whether he intended to marry soon. There were several suitable young women from good families interested in him. Thomas needed to think about his legacy, his responsibility to the family. Thomas, trying to maintain composure, said he wasn't ready for marriage yet. His father's eyes narrowed. He said Thomas seemed to be ready for something. That he'd been secretive, distracted, spending time alone when he should be handling plantation business. That his behavior was becoming concerning. Thomas insisted nothing was wrong, but his father wasn't convinced. He told Thomas he expected him to attend a ball the following week, where he would be introduced to Elizabeth Rutherford, daughter of a prominent Charleston family. Thomas felt the walls closing in. He realized time was running out faster than he'd anticipated. That night, Thomas met Sarah in the carriage house and told her they needed to leave sooner than planned. His father was suspicious. They couldn't wait until spring. They needed to go within the week, maybe within days. Sarah was terrified. They weren't ready. They didn't have all the information they needed. The weather was still cold. But she also knew Thomas was right. If his father discovered the truth, there would be no escape. She'd be sold away or worse, and Thomas's life, while not at risk, would be utterly controlled by his family. They agreed to leave in 3 days. On March 18, Thomas would gather supplies and money. Sarah would make final preparations. They'd meet at the carriage house at midnight and begin their journey north. But Thomas's father was more suspicious than Thomas realized. On March 16, he ordered Silas Crenshaw to search Sarah's quarters. Enslaved people weren't legally entitled to privacy, so there was no warning, no permission asked. Crenshaw tore through Sarah's small space in the servants' quarters behind the main house. And he found what he was looking for. Hidden under her thin mattress were letters. Letters in Thomas's handwriting, addressed to Sarah. Letters that spoke of love, of plans, of a future together. Letters that were evidence of something unthinkable. Crenshaw brought the letters immediately to Thomas's father. Thomas Whitmore too read them in his study, his face growing darker with each word. This was worse than he'd imagined. His son hadn't just had a momentary lapse, the kind of physical relationship between white men and enslaved women that happened all the time and was tacitly accepted as long as it wasn't spoken about openly. No, Thomas had fallen in love. He'd written about marriage, about building a life together, about escape. This was insurrection. This was betrayal. This threatened everything. Thomas's father called for him. It was 7 in the evening on March 16. Thomas walked into his father's study and saw the letters spread across the desk. The blood drained from his face. His father didn't yell. He was too controlled for that. He asked Thomas if he understood what he'd done. Thomas tried to explain, tried to make his father understand that Sarah was an extraordinary person, that the entire system of slavery was morally wrong, that he couldn't continue living a lie. His father listened in silence, and then he said something that revealed the true horror of the situation. He said Sarah would be sold tomorrow to a trader who supplied cotton plantations in Mississippi. A place where the work was harder, the conditions were worse, and the life expectancy was shorter. And if Thomas tried to interfere, his father would ensure Sarah's mother Margaret was sold too, along with everyone else Sarah cared about. Thomas felt his world collapse. He begged his father to reconsider. He offered to leave Charleston, to never see Sarah again, if his father would just let her stay. His father refused. The decision was made. Sarah had to go, and she had to go in a way that made it impossible for Thomas to follow. As punishment for corrupting the master's son, for daring to read and write and imagine herself as something other than property, she'd be sent to one of the worst places enslaved people could be sent. And Thomas would have to live with the knowledge that his love had destroyed her. Thomas left his father's study and immediately went looking for Sarah. He needed to warn her, needed to tell her to run tonight, immediately, without him if necessary. But when he got to the servants' quarters, she was already gone. His father had acted faster than he'd thought. She'd been locked in the plantation's punishment cell. A small, windowless room where enslaved people were held before being sold or punished. Thomas couldn't get to her. Guards had been posted. His father had thought of everything. That night, Thomas Whitmore III made a choice. He could accept his father's decision, let Sarah be sold, and live the rest of his life as the dutiful son of a plantation owner. It would be painful, but he'd survive. He'd eventually marry someone appropriate, have children, maintain the family fortune. The world would continue exactly as it had been. Or he could fight. He could try to free Sarah, even though the attempt would almost certainly fail and would destroy his relationship with his family forever. Even though it might get both of them killed. It wasn't really a choice at all. He loved her. That was the simple, terrible truth of it. He loved her more than he loved his family, more than he loved his inheritance, more than he loved the comfortable life he'd always known. At 2 a.m. on March 17, Thomas broke into the building where Sarah was being held. He'd bribed one of the guards, a young man who was sympathetic and needed money. He found Sarah in the dark cell, exhausted and terrified. He told her they were leaving now, tonight, with no plan and no preparation. They had to run. It was their only chance. Sarah knew it was probably suicide. She knew the patrols would catch them, that they'd never make it out of South Carolina. But she also knew that being sold to Mississippi was its own kind of death. So she agreed. They ran. Thomas had grabbed what money he could find in his father's study, along with 2 horses from the stable. They rode north, avoiding main roads, staying off paths where patrols might find them. They had no detailed plan, no network of safe houses ready. They were improvising, hoping luck and love would be enough. It wasn't. By dawn on March 17, the moment this story began. They'd made it about 40 miles north of Charleston. Thomas was standing at the window of a small boarding house run by a free black woman who'd agreed to hide them for a few hours. He was watching the sunrise and hoping against hope that they might actually make it. They didn't. The patrols found them that afternoon. Someone at the boarding house had informed, whether out of fear or for reward money, Thomas never learned. The patrol surrounded the house. There were 6 armed white men. Thomas and Sarah had nothing. Thomas tried to talk his way out, claiming Sarah was his property and he was taking her to be sold in Virginia. The patrol leader didn't believe him. They'd been told to watch for Thomas Whitmore. His father had reported him missing and suspected he'd try to help Sarah escape. The patrol arrested both of them. They were taken back to Charleston in chains. What happened next is documented in Charleston court records, though the documents tell only part of the story. Thomas was charged with theft, stealing his father's property, namely Sarah, and 2 horses. He wasn't charged with any crime related to loving Sarah, because loving an enslaved person wasn't technically illegal. Acting on that love, helping an enslaved person escape, that was illegal. Sarah was charged with attempting to run away, a crime for enslaved people that usually resulted in brutal physical punishment. The trial was held on March 19, 1860. It lasted 4 hours. Thomas's father testified against his own son, saying Thomas had been corrupted by Northern education and dangerous ideas. He asked the court to be lenient, suggesting Thomas was mentally unwell rather than genuinely criminal. The court agreed. Thomas was sentenced to 6 months in jail and ordered to pay a fine. After his release, he'd be disowned from the family but allowed to leave Charleston. Sarah's sentence was different. She was sentenced to 50 lashes and sold to the Mississippi plantation his father had arranged. The whipping was carried out the next day in Charleston's public square, as a warning to other enslaved people about the consequences of trying to escape. Margaret, Sarah's mother, was forced to watch. Thomas was still in jail and didn't see it happen, but he heard about it from his lawyer. The details were meant to break him, and they did. But that's not where the story ends. Because 3 days after her whipping, while being held before sale, Sarah died. The official cause of death was listed as complications from the punishment. Infection from the lash wounds was common and often fatal. But there were rumors that Sarah had found a way to end her own life rather than face sale and separation from everyone she'd ever known. The records don't confirm this, but several accounts from other enslaved people at the time suggest she'd saved a piece of broken glass and used it to open her veins. Whether she died from the whipping or from her own hand, the result was the same. She was dead at 22 years old. Thomas was released from jail in September 1860. He left Charleston immediately, as his father had ordered. He moved north to Pennsylvania, where he tried to build a new life. But the weight of what had happened crushed him. He'd loved Sarah, and his love had killed her. His attempt to save her had led directly to her death. That guilt was a physical thing he carried every day. Historical records show that Thomas Whitmore III lived in Philadelphia for 3 years. He worked as a clerk in a merchant's office. He lived alone in a boarding house. He spoke to almost no one. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, he enlisted in the Union Army. Perhaps seeking redemption, perhaps seeking death. He fought in several major battles. He survived the war physically intact but emotionally destroyed. After the war, in 1866, Thomas returned to South Carolina. Not to Charleston, he could never go back there. But to a small town about 100 miles inland. He used what little money he'd saved to buy a small plot of land. And here's where the story takes its final, unexpected turn. Thomas found Margaret, Sarah's mother. She'd been sold after Sarah's death, but emancipation at the end of the war had freed her. Thomas spent months tracking her down. When he finally found her, he asked for her forgiveness. He told her he knew his love for Sarah had destroyed her, that he'd been naive and selfish and that Sarah had paid the price for his ignorance. Margaret's response was recorded in a letter Thomas wrote years later to an old college friend. She said she didn't forgive him because there was nothing to forgive. Sarah had made her own choice. She'd chosen to love him knowing the risks. She'd chosen to try to escape knowing the likely outcome. Margaret said white people always thought enslaved people had no agency, no choice, no real feelings. But Sarah had been a complete person with her own mind and heart. She'd loved Thomas genuinely. And she died not because of his love but because of a system that made love between them impossible. Margaret told Thomas that if he truly wanted to honor Sarah's memory, he should spend the rest of his life fighting that system. Thomas did. For the next 40 years, he worked with freed black people in South Carolina, helping establish schools, fighting for voting rights, pushing back against the white supremacist violence that followed Reconstruction. He never married. He never loved anyone else. He kept a small photograph of Sarah. One of the only photographs ever taken of her, done secretly by a traveling photographer who'd come through Charleston in 1859. He kept it in his pocket every day until he died in 1906 at the age of 70. The photograph survived. It's now in the collection of the South Carolina Historical Society, though Sarah is identified only as unidentified house servant, Whitmore Plantation, circa 1859. Most people who see it don't know her story. They don't know about the forbidden love, the desperate escape attempt, the tragic ending. They just see a young black woman staring at the camera with an expression that's hard to read. But if you know the story, you can see it in her eyes. Intelligence. Strength. A kind of quiet defiance. And maybe, just maybe, hope that somehow, someday, the world might be different. Thomas kept journals throughout his life, and those journals survived too. In one entry from 1890, 30 years after Sarah's death, he wrote about her. He said he'd learned that love alone wasn't enough. That good intentions from privileged people couldn't overcome systems of oppression. That he'd been arrogant to think his love could save Sarah when what Sarah needed was freedom, not rescue. He wrote that the real tragedy wasn't just that they couldn't be together, but that a system existed that made her very humanity conditional, that treated people as property, that crushed love and hope and possibility for millions of human beings. He wrote that he'd spent 3 decades working to dismantle that system, and that he'd failed. That even after slavery ended, new systems of oppression had risen to replace it. That the struggle was ongoing and might never end. But he also wrote that knowing Sarah had been the most important thing in his life. That loving her had taught him what it meant to see another person fully, to recognize their complete humanity. That their brief time together had changed him in ways that made the rest of his life make sense. He wrote that if he could go back, even knowing how it would end, he'd do everything the same way. Because the alternative would be to have never really seen her at all. And that would be the real tragedy. The story of Thomas Whitmore III and Sarah doesn't fit neatly into any category. It's not a simple romance. The power dynamics were too complicated, too contaminated by slavery. It's not a redemption story. Thomas didn't redeem himself through his later work, and Sarah didn't get saved. It's not even really a love story, at least not in the traditional sense. It's a story about how systems of oppression destroy human connection. About how even the best intentions can lead to catastrophic outcomes when those intentions exist within structures of profound injustice. About how love, real love, requires seeing the other person fully, not as a symbol or a cause or a way to prove your own virtue, but as a complete human being with their own agency and destiny. Charleston in 1860 was a city on the brink of war. Within a year, Confederate forces would fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, starting the Civil War. Within 5 years, slavery would be abolished, though its legacy would continue for generations. But in March of 1860, all of that was still ahead. What happened to Thomas and Sarah was just one small tragedy in a system built on tragedy. 2 people who loved each other in a world that made their love impossible. 2 people who tried to escape and failed. 2 people whose story would be mostly forgotten, reduced to rumors and whispers, until almost nobody remembered their names. Except Thomas remembered. And Margaret remembered. And in his journals and letters, Thomas made sure the story was recorded, even if it was only read by a few historians a century later. He made sure Sarah wasn't erased entirely. He made sure that somewhere in the historical record, there was evidence that she'd existed, that she'd been brilliant and brave, that she'd been loved. It's a small thing, documentation. But in a system designed to treat people as if they didn't matter, as if they were things rather than humans, being remembered is an act of resistance. The plantation at Ashwood Hall still exists, though it's been divided up and sold off over the years. The main house is gone, burned during the Civil War. But some of the old outbuildings remain, including the carriage house where Thomas and Sarah used to meet. There's no historical marker, nothing to indicate what happened there. It's just an old building slowly falling apart. But if you know the story, if you stand there in the place where they used to talk and laugh and plan their impossible future, you can feel the weight of it. The weight of hope and fear and love and loss. The weight of two people who tried to be free and paid everything for the attempt. In the end, what's the lesson here? What do we take from this story about two people who loved each other in 1860 Charleston and were destroyed by that love? Maybe it's that systems matter more than individuals. That personal virtue or good intentions can't overcome structural evil. That love, while valuable, while maybe the most important thing humans are capable of, isn't enough by itself to change the world. Or maybe the lesson is different. Maybe it's that love is always worth it, even when it ends in tragedy. That the brief time Thomas and Sarah had together, those nights in the carriage house talking about books and freedom and possibility, were worth the terrible price they paid. That being seen, being loved, being recognized as fully human, even for a moment, is worth almost anything. Or maybe there's no clean lesson at all. Maybe some stories are just stories, records of things that happened, evidence that people lived and loved and suffered and died. Maybe the value is just in the telling, in making sure these voices aren't completely silenced by history. In saying yes, this happened. These people existed. Their love was real. And what happened to them was an injustice that shouldn't be forgotten. If you found this story powerful, if it made you think about love and freedom and the systems that constrain both, then please subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button, leave a comment telling me what you think, and share this story with others. These dark history stories need to be told and remembered. The past shapes the present in ways we often don't recognize, and understanding that history helps us understand ourselves. So subscribe, like, comment, and share. And thank you for listening to the story of Thomas Whitmore III and Sarah, two people who dared to love in a world designed to make their love impossible.